Hello everyone, this week I started working on my first original Mario Kart 8 Deluxe custom track in several years, and today I'm gonna take you through that process. The reason I haven't made the track since 2023 is because it's been impossible to balance working on a large-scale project like this alongside my weekly YouTube upload schedule. So creating this devlog series is the solution to that issue. Another roadblock has been the fact that most of the ideas I've come up with for custom tracks in the past few years have been very ambitious. For example, 2 years ago I spent quite some time prepping for a potential massive Super Mario Bros. Wonder themed custom track. Because the original game mostly doesn't rely on 3D models, this idea required me to manually recreate many iconic assets. So although I'm not sure if this project will ever come to fruition, at least working on it actually taught me quite a lot about 3D modeling assets from scratch. Okay, so if not the Wonder track, then what are we gonna be working on in this series? Well, say hello to Wiggler Wilds, a somewhat simpler track concept that still features several cool setups, I think. This potential track actually predates the idea of the Wonder one, since what inspired its theming was Wiggler being added as a playable character in the Booster Course Pass more than 3 years ago. I was originally planning on having it feature an elaborate anti-gravity section, since I was never that satisfied with the way I integrated that gimmick into my previous tracks, but when I finally decided to give the project another shot more recently, I changed my plans regarding this part of the track, so in its current state it doesn't feature anti-gravity whatsoever. And on that note, let's go through the layout real quick. The track starts with a 180-degree turn that angles slightly downward, followed by another similar turn that is populated by bramble enemies. If you've played Mario Kart World, you'll probably immediately think of the traffic light looking brambles in that game, but believe it or not, I actually came up with adding the enemies to this track before we knew about those. As you can probably tell, my Mario Kart 8 brambles are just a remodel of the original game's pokey enemies, which bend back and forth. It's definitely quite janky, but I think I made it work. Anyways, so the idea is that the player can boost under the legs of this bramble in the grass as a shortcut, and this here is another grass shortcut that leads to a ramp and an alternate route that I'll talk about in a second. The main route also has the player jump off a ramp and land in a section where a stampede of Wigglers moves towards them. The plan is to make the Wigglers disappear into tunnels in the walls to allow them to circle back to the start. After another turn and another jump ramp, this section is also very unique. This thing is supposed to be like the rotating logs from New Super Mario Bros. Wii and U, so the player is supposed to drive across one of those and try not to fall off. So this is basically a take on the rotating cylinder part of DS Bowser Castle. If they do fall off, I'm planning on making this purple water the type that they can drive through, though obviously that should be slower than staying on. These things represent purple spiny Cheep Cheeps, which I'm hoping I can make jump across the log to spice things up a bit. After that section, the track ends with a few more turns, which I could potentially add another Wiggler or Bramble to or something. Though the main attraction here is this massive Wiggler down below, and the fact that you should be able to cut across this gap by bouncing on the flower on its head. As for the shortcut route, this winds its way above the regular route and cuts across it several times. Currently, I don't have any crazy gimmicks planned for it, but I'm sure I'll end up adding some stuff. This ramp makes it to where players are lined up perfectly to take the gap jump shortcut, which should make this whole thing worthwhile, I think. As you can tell, this drawing is very bare bones, so although I included some suggestions of what the terrain might look like, for the most part I'm planning on figuring out the track's visuals as I go. But we don't have to worry about that for now, because this week I basically only worked on the track's gameplay implementation. So let's see how that went. As is tradition, I started working on the track by applying an array and curve modifier to a simple set of polygons, which allowed me to shape the road mesh. As you can see, at first I made the most basic possible version of the track layout just to test if I even still knew what I was doing after all these years, and apparently I did, because I managed to get this thing to work in-game. While I show this footage, I should make it very clear that, again, we won't be worrying about visuals basically at all this week. I usually end up tweaking meshes until the very end of the track creation process, so adding a proper UV map or material to the road or terrain this early on is completely pointless. I did end up making things a bit nicer to look at down the line, but none of that is permanent either. Anyways, the next step was to repeatedly tweak the road curve until I was satisfied with the shape of the turns, and also add these side parts to the mesh. These will end up being the transition point between the road and the grass. In the original game's tracks, dirt roads always have this cool visual thing where the grass around them sticks out across the ground, making for a very realistic transition between terrain types. But I never bothered with that sort of thing in my previous custom tracks because it seemed too complicated to implement. However, I'm pretty sure with the way I've set this up, I should finally be able to get it to work. Okay, so now that I was happy with the basic road setup, I started figuring out the implementation of the shortcut route. Since accessing this part of the track relies on a grass shortcut, I had to commit to adding some terrain far earlier than I would have done normally. Also, stuff like the shape of this ramp isn't final whatsoever. In fact, the entire jump is a bit janky at the moment, but this is exactly the kind of stuff I'll keep tweaking as we go. Something that surprisingly isn't really that janky at all though is the flower gap jump shortcut. Though even with that, a problem I did run into was that this supposed shortcut route actually took roughly the same amount of time as playing through the track normally, which is something I ended up solving in a very simple way later on. Regardless, for now I decided to finally start working on some of the track's gameplay gimmicks. I implemented these two jumps into the road mesh and made a special secondary type of road for the wigglers. This is the path they'll walk along behind the scenes to loop back to the start of the Stampede section. My plan was to make the wigglers walk in a sort of figure-8 formation by making them cross to the other side of the road each time they emerge, which would make them even more of a threat for the player at this point, and also ensure that all 5 of the wigglers would be synced since they'd all be attached to the same rail. But this is where I ran into a problem because seemingly only one of them was spawning in-game. I assumed that maybe only one wiggler could be attached to the same rail at a time, so I duplicated my setup and attached each wiggler to a separate rail. But not only did my duplicate rails glitch out, but that still didn't solve the overall issue. As it turns out, the problem wasn't that multiple wigglers can't be attached to the same rail, it's that the parameter that determines which node of the rail they spawn on is seemingly just ignored. So they were all spawning on top of each other, which was impossible for me to tell. That meant the solution was to not only attach each wiggler to its own rail, but also go into the track's raw data and manually switch around the order of the rail nodes to make each wiggler start at a different point. Although I can still barely believe it, that worked. I managed to synchronize 5 wigglers to all walk in a figure-8 formation across their own dedicated roads just to make this relatively unremarkable Stampede section. The next thing I decided to focus on was the rotating log, which actually I decided wouldn't technically be rotating, but just use a collision type that pushes the player off to the left. Paired with a scrolling texture that should still make it look like the log is rotating, this would avoid all of the jankiness that would have come with trying to make a custom rotating map object, whilst also allowing for much more flexibility when it comes to potential future tweaks. As you can see here, at first I made the entire cylinder's collision trickable, but later I decided that didn't really make any sense, so I made it to where you can only trick off of the edge. Then I added the cheap jeeps that jump over top of the log. I don't think there's any way to change the jumping height of these things, but thankfully their default jump just barely clears the log without the rails needing to be placed above where I wanted the water to go. Just like with the wigglers, I made sure the Cheep Cheeps are spread evenly and synchronized. I actually made this bramble remodel I showed earlier like 3 years ago, but it was only at this point that I added these things to the track. I would have loved to make them maybe twice their default size, but sadly that's not really an option since scaling the brambles up doesn't affect the position of the coin they spawn accordingly. This means the bramble grass shortcut thing is even more tricky to pull off than I'd imagined, so I might end up changing the way that's implemented at a later date. This is the point where I came up with a fix for the fact that the shortcut route wasn't fast enough, which was of course to spam it with boost panels. These two turns were always kinda wide and awkward anyways, so actually adding boost panels made them much more fun to drive on. I also added 2 small boost panels to the Stampede section to encourage players to weave between the wigglers, which I think worked pretty well. Although earlier I said we wouldn't do any visuals related stuff this week, I did take some time to figure out one specific part of the track's presentation. You may have noticed in the concept art how there's the body of water with the rotating log here, and then a waterfall, and then a much lower body of water, which is what the giant wiggler is standing in, and honestly, using this at the start of the video was a bit misleading because I only made this version of this art after the iteration of the track I'm about to show, because I had no idea how I was gonna structure this stuff beforehand. So I decided to start modeling the bottom surface of the pool of water that houses the rotating log and the way it connects to the road and grass around it, just to get to grips with how all of this stuff could be integrated. The way this part of the track is put together ended up being inspired by the water section at the end of DK Jungle. So just for good measure, I also decided to steal the track's lighting and materials as a temporary thing. The goal here wasn't to make this underwater section actually look any good yet, but just to figure out if it was even possible for me to model this in the way I'd planned, and that did end up working out. The reason the underwater section is actually underwater now is because I added this invisible water box object here, whereas the visuals of the water surface are a completely separate part of the track model. Okay, now let's talk about 2 subtle problems I ran into related to the player's line of sight. You may have noticed earlier how when I jumped off this ramp before the wiggler section, there was no way to see the wigglers approaching until I was in the air. Technically, blind jumps in Mario Kart tracks aren't the worst thing ever, like this jump onto the log is blind too, but here this meant there was no way for the player to adjust their positioning to account for the wigglers. So I fixed this by drastically lowering the angle of the ramp, which not only made the wigglers easy to see ahead of time, but also meant players spent less time in the air and more time having to dodge them. A similar sort of issue presented itself when it came to this flower gap jump shortcut, because it was impossible to actually see the flower before dashing towards it. Now, I couldn't just lower this part of the terrain or raise the flower to fix this, because that would make it impossible to clear the gap. But what I found was that raising up this part of the road between the water section and the shortcut changed the player's camera angle enough to where the flower is just barely visible ahead of time. Finally, let's tackle one more issue, because why does this part of the track suddenly look like it's underwater? Well, this happened when I made the track use the lighting of DK Jungle, and as it turns out, that's because this part overlaps with where the underwater section of that track is. So this box in the BGM model tells the game to make the lighting blue here because that's what it's supposed to look like underwater. So all I had to do to fix this was move the boxes away. It's gonna be a while before we have to worry about allocating these kinds of areas to the custom track's various sections. The very last thing I did for the track this week was giving the boost panels proper visuals, just because that was a finicky task that would have to be done eventually either way. Making sure the panel edge pieces all lined up properly and giving those proper UV maps actually took more time than you might think, though this isn't a process worth going into, I guess. So after one episode of work, this is what the track looks like so far. And I guess to give you a better feel for it, let's check it out in game. Okay, and here we are. So obviously, as I've talked about again and again, nothing is done visually yet. Though I suppose what I haven't really talked about much yet is the fact that I did model quite a bit of grass around the edges here, so there's not just the sort of default automated grass stuff, but there's also all of this additional stuff. And the idea will be that, of course, you can also take like mushroom shortcuts across this. Though I'm also going to make sure that there's going to be stuff blocking the player from, like, for example, shrooming all the way across here. Obviously, I do want to make things not completely overpowered in terms of mushroom shortcuts. We don't want to do any, like, Mario Kart World stuff where you can just, like, take a golden shroom and get, like, 10 seconds ahead of the other players. That doesn't really seem fair. Yeah, we have the brambles here. I think they look pretty good in the DK jungle lighting here, actually. Though, I think there is a chance that I'm gonna end up changing them somehow. I might, like, just work on the model a bit more, maybe fix some of the materials. But also, there's a chance I might just completely rework this entire part and come up with a different gimmick. I'm not entirely sure about these guys yet. They seem a bit janky, like the way they wiggle their legs around and don't quite touch the ground and stuff. It's all not quite perfect, and also, like, the hitbox, for example, you can see I'm kind of like bumping into nothing. Normally hitboxes are smaller than the player model, but this one is actually bigger, and that's a bit strange. But I don't know yet. I mean, obviously, also they don't relate to Wigglers in any way, so it's kind of weird to have the first enemy in Wiggler Wilds not be Wigglers. But I guess we'll see how I continue to evolve this stuff. Over here we have the Wiggler section, I guess, which we can actually see coming towards us now with the changed angle of the ramp there, and we have the boost panels that the Wigglers walk across. And like I talked about, the idea is that because the Wigglers sort of cross to the other side of the road, they're always going to be an obstacle for the player, even if the player decides to mostly drive in the middle of the road here, because for the most part, apart from that, they're just on the sides. But they also, of course, still cover the boost panels, which means that sometimes if you get unlucky with the timing, like right here maybe, you can't really get onto that boost panel, and so that kind of makes things a bit like dynamic and whatnot. It's a lot like the vertical part at the end of Rock Mountain, I guess, but with wigglers instead of boulders. Here we have the jump onto the rotating log, which I think this section works. I might end up fiddling with the exact settings for the rotation speed here and whatnot. You can see it's maybe a bit slow at the moment, though I don't know. It also depends on like how it's going to look visually and whatnot to have the log rotating at different speeds. And oh yeah, there we can see the cheap jumping across as well, and we can also trick off of the edge. I'm not a huge fan of the way, like, even at full speed, you still end up kind of landing in the water a little bit, but the problem there is that if I drive under here, like, I can't really make the log any closer to the road here, because, like, then the camera would probably, like, glitch out if I drove under here. So it's a bit of a strange conundrum that I'm gonna have to find a fix for, maybe, or maybe I'll just make it so, yeah, you do end up dropping in the water a bit, even during the normal route. But the idea, of course, is that if you do fall down here, this is a bit of a punishment, and it probably takes a bit longer, though I haven't really tested that. I just assume that's how it works, because I'm pretty sure underwater driving is slower than normal driving by default. Yeah, we have the lake here, which is probably going to get reworked quite a bit more, but I did make it just to make sure I even knew what I was doing in terms of the modeling here. And so there's going to be a waterfall right here, and then like cliffs, and there's going to be a giant wiggler down there, and this flower, of course, is going to be like on top of that wiggler, and it's going to be remodeled and whatnot. So I think that's going to work. But continuing on, I guess what I should also talk about is the shortcut route. So let me go over there. Here we are. So I'm pretty sure this, like the way this is all set up, is gonna get changed in some way, because I'm not a huge fan of the way you can just barely make it on top of here, and that might also be physically impossible in 50cc. Let me make sure I don't fall off. And like with 200cc, like this is all just a bit janky, so I might end up changing the way this whole route is implemented. But as for the gameplay here, I actually do quite like how this plays with the boost panels and the like very wide angle turn. I think that all feels pretty good. And then like having this section here not have any boost panels because like you have to do a bit more like wiggling around here in terms of the turns, and so I didn't think that would work. Also, the idea here is that this part is not going to be like actual terrain by the end. I'm probably going to make this like wood or something like scaffolding, because of course we're right above the lake right now, and so having the terrain float above the lake isn't what I want it to look like in the end. So I'm probably going to have this be wood, and then also have the start here be wood up until maybe like the boost panel here. And yeah, we have more terrain here, and then this ramp that leads perfectly onto the flower, which I can never get a trick off of for some reason. But oh well. Yeah, but so far I'm super happy with how this track has turned out. There are definitely things that I'm going to change, like I talked about. But yeah, for the most part, especially for only a handful of days of progress, this has all turned out pretty good, I think. Alright, to end things off, I want to set some expectations in terms of what you can expect from this series moving forward. The thing is, even though so far this process has mostly gone pretty smoothly, I'm honestly kinda uncertain about how things will progress from here. In the past, making a track has usually only taken me a handful of weeks, but not only is this track more elaborate than any I've made before, but making a video like this about the process every week is gonna eat up a lot of time. So there's a chance this series is gonna drag on for months, and that's assuming I can stay motivated to keep going that entire time. For now though, I'm pretty excited to finish this video so I can continue working on the track again, so that's gonna do it for today. One thing that might help my motivation is if you left a comment with some suggestions for what I should add to or change about the track, or gave the video a like or subscribed or whatever. I also have a public Discord server linked in the description, and if you want to support the channel and get early access to my videos, maybe consider signing up for a membership. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!